What is the most scariest but still unexplained thing that you have experienced? Growing up in a quiet, mostly nondescript Midwestern town, I never really gave much thought to how strange the ordinary could become. Life followed its rhythms, like the seasons slowly turning. My family lived on the edge of town, just close enough to the rail yard that I could hear the long, hollow whistles of the freight trains at night. Some people say that sound is nostalgic, comforting even, a reminder of movement and possibility in the vastness of the night. But to me, those whistles always felt eerie. I'm not sure why they bothered me so much. I was just a kid, 5 or 6 years old, when the sound started to affect me. Maybe it was the unpredictability. Maybe it was the sheer loneliness of the noise, that distant, hollow wail slicing through the stillness, long after the sun had disappeared and left the world feeling abandoned. Every night, like clockwork, the trains would rumble through the yard, the screech of steel on steel, and the long, mournful blow of the horns seeping into my room. At first, I would lie in bed, stiff as a board, wide-eyed in the dark. Just listening. The sound unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain to my parents. They didn't understand how it felt like the trains were calling to something deep inside me, something fearful and vulnerable. It was almost as though the trains carried with them a message I was too young to decode, but instinctively knew was not meant for me to hear. Eventually, after enough sleepless nights and too many mornings spent rubbing my eyes from exhaustion, parents let me keep the radio on at night. It wasn't much, just a little portable thing that sat on my bedside table, barely louder than a whisper, but it helped. The familiar hum of the local stations created a blanket of noise that muffled the sharp, intrusive blasts of the train whistle. I grew used to the soft drone of the radio, and after a while I couldn't sleep without it. There was something comforting in its predictability, in knowing that whatever weirdness was out there in the night couldn't get to me if I surrounded myself with something consistent, something solid. As the years passed, the radio became a permanent fixture in my room. I'd keep it on low, usually tuned to the same station. Even after the fear of the trains dulled to a kind of distant unease, I clung to that sound. My autism had made certain aspects of life feel a little more overwhelming than they probably should have. Sleep, especially, was a battle. Too many thoughts, too much stimulation. The radio was a kind of balm against that, something that helped organize the chaos in my head into something manageable. When I was about 10 years old, something strange happened. It was one of those sticky summer evenings where the air clung to you, thick with humidity, and everything felt sluggish and slow. My parents had gone to bed early, and I was alone in my room with the lamp casting a warm pool of light onto my book. I was always a night owl, lost in whatever fantasy world I had chosen to escape into, the steady murmur of the radio as my constant companion. That night I got up to grab a drink of water, and in my half-asleep haze I bumped the glass. I watched in slow motion as it tipped over, spilling across the table, right onto the radio. For a second, nothing happened. I froze, the liquid seeping into the radio's tiny crevices. Then, with a sputter and a pop, the radio began to make the weirdest sounds I'd ever heard. It wasn't static exactly. It was more like the sound of wind rushing through a tunnel, echoing and hollow, layered with faint voices just on the edge of perception. I quickly unplugged it, cursing my clumsiness, but when I plugged it back in, hoping for some miracle that it would still work, the radio didn't return to its usual gentle hum. Instead, it was picking up something different. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's just a broken radio, I told myself. But then I began to notice that the stations it was pulling in weren't the ones I was used to. The familiar voices of the local DJs were gone, replaced by strange broadcasts in languages I didn't recognize. Some of them were barely intelligible, fuzzy and distant, like they were being transmitted from another planet, but others came through as clear as day. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the little box as it filled my room with sounds from places I couldn't even imagine. The strangest part was how normal it all felt at first. Maybe I was too young to understand just how weird this actually was. I was fascinated, leaning in closer, trying to decipher the words. It wasn't the typical foreign language station you'd get by accident either. It was something else entirely. One night, after weeks of catching odd fragments of broadcasts from what I assumed were faraway places, I heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I had just finished reading, and the radio was quietly humming away in the background when the station flickered and shifted. A new voice came through, this one different from the others. It was calm, methodical, speaking in a language I didn't know, but I felt like I could understand it, even though I had no idea what the words meant. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to that voice. Something about it tugged at me deep down. There was a rhythm to the speech, like it was telling me a secret, pulling me into a story that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. The voice continued for a while, steady and unbroken, until suddenly it cut off. The silence that followed felt deafening. After that, the radio went dead for the rest of the night. I sat there, staring at it, half expecting the voice to come back, but it didn't. From that night on, things started to get weirder. Then one night, things got weirder. I was lying in bed, the soft light from my bedside lamp casting a dim glow across the room, a book splayed open across my chest. The radio had been doing its usual thing. Low, steady background noise, enough to drown out the occasional train whistle that still drifted in from the rail yard. I was drifting off, my eyelids growing heavier when I noticed it, the sound. At first it was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the static hum of the radio. It wasn't something I immediately picked up on, more like a feeling that nudged me out of my half-asleep state. The longer I lay there, the clearer it became. It was music, or at least it sounded like music, sort of. It was just a series of notes, played slowly, as if someone were tentatively experimenting on a keyboard, trying to figure out what sound came next. But there was something off about it. The notes didn't follow any pattern I could recognize. There was no rhythm, no melody, no repetition. It was random, disjointed, like the person playing didn't quite know how music was supposed to work. The randomness of it unsettled me. I strained to listen, trying to find some sense in it. But the more I focused, the weirder it became. The notes would come in bursts, a few at a time, then stop abruptly, only to start again minutes later. Sometimes they were high-pitched, sharp like a shrill whistle. Other times they were deep, resonant, echoing as if they were being played in a vast, empty space. And it was growing louder. I turned to face the radio, my heart beating a little faster now. I'd heard odd things on the radio before. Strange stations, voices speaking in languages I couldn't place. But this was different. This felt wrong. As the minutes dragged on, the sound continued to grow in intensity, filling the room. My mind raced. What was I hearing? Some experimental broadcast? A signal? Then an idea flashed through my head, sudden and electric. Could it be aliens? It was ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the thought. The way the sound shifted unpredictably, the way the notes seemed to echo through some vast, unknowable space. It felt like something out of a science fiction movie, like I was picking up a transmission that wasn't meant for human ears. The radio, ever since I'd spilled water on it, had been acting like a portal to another world, pulling in strange broadcasts from far-off places. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe this was something I wasn't supposed to hear. I sat up, wide awake now, my skin prickling with a mix of excitement and fear. My fingers hovered over the dial, ready to turn it off, but something held me back. I wanted to know what this was. I needed to know. But as the sound continued to fill my room, louder and more chaotic, it became harder to keep my fear at bay. What if I wasn't just imagining things? What if there really was something out there, broadcasting directly into my room? The sound started to shift again. Now, instead of just the strange notes, there was a low hum beneath it, vibrating through the air like a distant engine. It was deep, almost imperceptible at first, but as I listened, it grew louder and louder until I could feel it in my bones. My heart pounded in my chest and every muscle in my body tensed. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I jumped out of bed, knocking over the book that had been resting on my chest, and bolted out of my room, my feet barely making contact with the floor as I rushed down the hallway. My parents' room was at the far end of the house, and I made a beeline, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I burst through the door without knocking, waking my mum from her sleep. "Mum," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something wrong with the radio. I think I'm picking up something weird." She stirred, squinting at me through bleary eyes. "What are you talking about, honey? It's the middle of the night." I tugged at her arm, desperate for her to take me seriously. Just come listen, please." Groggy and half awake, she reluctantly climbed out of bed, slipping her feet into her slippers as I led her back to my room. The hallway felt longer than usual, darker too. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. When we got to my room, I stopped at the doorway, my heart thudding in my ears. The sound was still there, filling the room with its strange, alien music. Mum stood in the doorway for a moment, her face creased in confusion. She stepped forward and bent down, pressing her ear closer to the radio. For a long moment, she just listened, her head tilted slightly. Then, she straightened up and looked at her expression a mix of confusion and mild annoyance. "It's just static, sweetie," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Probably just a bad signal. Why don't you turn it off for the night?" "No, Mum, listen, it's not just static, it's something else. Don't you hear it?" She sighed, clearly too tired to engage in whatever bizarre thing I was going through at the moment. "It's late, and you need to sleep. Just change the station or turn it off, okay? It's nothing to worry about." I wanted to argue, to tell her that something strange was really happening, but the words wouldn't come. Her exhaustion made it clear that this conversation wasn't going to go anywhere. So, reluctantly, I nodded, and she gave me a small, tired smile before retreating down the hall. Once she was gone, I turned back to the radio, still convinced that there was something more to it than just a bad signal. But I couldn't shake the look on my mum's face. The way she'd listened and heard nothing out of the ordinary. Was I losing it? Had my imagination spun out of control, conjuring something that wasn't really there? I reached over to the radio and twisted the dial, trying to find a different station, something normal. But as I turned the knob, the music, if you could call it that, remained. No matter how far I turned the dial, the sound stayed exactly the same, like it was stuck in one endless loop. No other stations came through, just that same chaotic series of notes. My heart sank. I yanked the plug from the wall, silencing the radio in an instant. The room felt unbearably quiet without it. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the now silent radio, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That night, I lay awake for hours, my mind running in circles. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to hear, something not from this world. And I was certain, whatever it wasn't over yet. The next night, I turned the radio back on, hoping, half expecting, to hear those strange, disjointed notes again. Part of me dreaded, but there was another part, buried deeper, that wanted more. It was that same strange curiosity that drives people to the edge of cliffs, just to see how far they can look down before the fear becomes too much. But this time, the radio offered nothing, just static. White noise that hissed and crackled, occasionally punctuated by brief bursts of interference. It wasn't unusual, really, but after what I'd heard the night before, the normalcy of it felt strange in itself. I twisted the dial back and forth, hoping I might stumble onto that bizarre transmission, but it was gone, as if it had never existed. Relieved, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and yet there was an undeniable thread of disappointment running through me. As much as that sound had scared me, the idea that I might never hear it again made me feel like I'd lost something. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell anyone, not even my parents. Mum had already brushed off the whole thing as a bad signal, and I didn't want to push it. I figured that even if something strange had happened, it was just some kind of fluke, the kind of weird random event that has no explanation. But still, I kept the radio on at night, more out of habit than hope. Then Christmas came around. I remember that year because it snowed on Christmas morning, which was rare for our part of the Midwest. My family wasn't big on extravagant gifts, but that year, my parents surprised me with something unexpected. A new radio, sleeker, newer, with better sound quality. They probably figured it was time for an upgrade after I'd spilled water on the old one. I pretended to be excited, but deep down, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. The new radio didn't have the same charm as the old one. It was just ordinary. I used it, sure, but that sense of mystery, the idea that I might tune into something bizarre or otherworldly, was gone. I missed the old crackly one that had felt like it could pull voices from the edge of the earth. Time passed, and I grew up. The radio incident faded into the background. One of those half-forgotten childhood memories that sits at the edge of your mind, blending in with all the others. Life moved on. I went to high school, then college, and the strange nights with the radio became little more than a weird story I sometimes thought about when I was in a nostalgic mood. But the feeling that something was unfinished always lingered, even if I didn't fully understand why. Years later, around 2012, I was mindlessly scrolling through the internet when I came across an article on Cracked about unexplained phenomena. You know the type. Clickbait list designed to entertain, freak you out a little, and then leave you scrolling onto the next thing. I wasn't expecting anything serious, but as I read through the list, something caught my eye. It was an entry about strange sounds from the radio, something called a number station. The article explained that during the Cold War, these mysterious stations had been used to communicate with spies. They would broadcast strings of seemingly random numbers or sounds, but the messages were encoded, intended only for the ears of the right people. Spies who knew how to decipher. It was all very cloak and dagger, very James Bond, but it was the mention of a specific type of signal that sent a chill down my spine. The article described something called a slow polytone, a signal made up of random, eerie tones with no discernible pattern. As I read the description, I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. It was exactly what I had heard all those years ago, those random, disjointed notes that had filled my room late at night. The strange lack of rhythm, the feeling that it wasn't music, but something else, something alien. I sat there, staring at the screen, a deep sense of unease creeping through me. Could it be? Had I stumbled onto one of these broadcasts as a kid, completely by accident? The rational part of my brain said it wasn't possible. These stations were supposed to be transmitted at high frequencies, often encrypted, and they certainly weren't aimed at kids in Midwestern bedrooms. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became. There was no other explanation that made sense. What I'd heard hadn't been a normal broadcast. It hadn't been music or a random bit of interference. It was a transmission, a signal meant for someone else, something I wasn't supposed to hear. As I kept reading, the article mentioned how these number stations still exist today, though far fewer than during the Cold War. Some people speculate they're still used by governments to communicate with agents in the field. Others think they're relics of a bygone era, still transmitting their eerie signals out into the void, even though no one's listening. The thought haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had tuned into something secret, something dangerous, and yet there was a part of me that was still drawn to it, the same part that had made me keep the radio on every night, hoping I might hear it again. For a few days I was obsessed. I scoured the internet, digging up every article, every forum post I could find about number stations. There were communities online dedicated to tracking these broadcasts, people who recorded the signals and tried to decode them, though most of it was just speculation. I listened to recordings people had uploaded, my heart pounding as I waited to hear something familiar. But I never found the exact sound I had heard. There were close matches, other polytone signals, weird, unearthly sounds that sent a shiver down my spine. None of them were quite right. The signal I had heard as a kid was lost to time, a fleeting moment that existed only in my memory. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wondered who the message had been. What was it saying? Had I caught the middle of some secret communication between spies? Or was it something even stranger, something beyond our understanding? The questions gnawed at me. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that what I had heard that night wasn't just some random glitch. It had been intentional. I just didn't know how or why. The whole thing felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. No matter how hard I tried to fit it together, there were always gaps, always something just beyond my grasp. Eventually, life caught up with me again. Work, relationships, the everyday grind of adulthood. It all pushed the mystery of the radio further to the back of my mind. But every now and then, when the world quieted down, I'd think back to that night, to the notes that didn't make sense, to the feeling that I had tuned into something meant for someone else. Even now, I can't listen to a radio without wondering what else is out there, broadcasting in the dark, just waiting for someone to stumble onto it by accident, waiting for the right pair of ears to hear the wrong thing. Each note in the slow polytone had a purpose, even if it didn't seem like it at first. What I had once thought were random, eerie noises turned out to be part of a coded message, one that was designed to sound disorganized and nonsensical to anyone who didn't know how to decode it. It was brilliant. The randomness was a cover, an impenetrable wall for the average listener, but to the right ears, it was communication, a secret, hidden in plain sight. As I sat there in front of my computer, staring at the article on number stations, everything clicked into place. That night with my broken radio all those years ago, what I had heard wasn't the supernatural, or a message from outer space. It wasn't some strange signal from an unknown dimension as my childhood imagination had conjured. No, it was something much more real, and in many ways, More chilling, it was espionage. That realization hit me like a bolt of light. The signal I'd picked up had been a relic from a bygone era of covert communication, one where spies and operatives received their orders through coded transmissions beamed out over the airwaves. It was a world of Cold War intrigue, of spies lurking in the shadows, waiting to hear the sound of a number station crackle to life and deliver a message only they could understand. And somehow, purely by accident, I had stumbled into that world. Suddenly, what had once been a source of confusion and fear became something else entirely. It became a passion, a drive, a hunger to understand more. That night in 2012, after hours of reading and listening to recordings of number stations, I realized that I had tapped into something bigger than myself. It was more than just the thrill of solving a childhood mystery. This was a hidden world, one that existed alongside our everyday lives, invisible but always there, humming quietly beneath the surface. I needed to know more. I had to hear those signals again. I dug through old forum posts, joined online communities where people talked obsessively about these stations, sharing new discoveries and theories. I found lists of known number stations, including those still broadcasting sporadically in the 21st century. I started staying up late at night, just like I had as a kid, scanning through frequencies, hoping to catch a glimpse, or rather a sound, of something strange. And I did. The first time I picked up a number station, it was as thrilling as it was surreal. I was sitting in my cramped apartment, the old radio I'd bought at a garage sale humming softly on my desk. It was late, sometime around 1 a.m., and I was half dozing, my mind wandering, when suddenly the static shifted. At first it was faint, just a whisper beneath the usual noise. But as I carefully adjusted the dial, the sound grew clearer. There it was, that same eerie disjointedness. The one that had haunted me since I was 10. The slow, methodical tones, coming one after the other. No melody or rhythm, just patterns, broken but deliberate. My heart raced. I grabbed a notebook, hastily scribbling down the time, the frequency, and whatever notes I could hear. It wasn't exactly the same as the one from my childhood, but it was close. Close enough to send a shiver down my spine. I had found it again. The world of number stations. From then on, it became a regular part of my life. I'd spend hours each week, late at night or on weekends, sitting in front of my radio, notebook at the ready, waiting for something unusual to come through the static. Sometimes I'd hear nothing but fuzz, the airwaves dead and empty. Other times, I'd catch faint broadcasts, numbers being read in monotone voices, sometimes in English, sometimes in other languages. Occasionally, I'd hear those strange tones again. The slow polytonies, or variations of them. Each time I found one, it felt like a victory, a tiny glimpse into a world I wasn't supposed to see. I started keeping detailed logs, journal entries documenting each station I encountered. I'd note the time, the frequency, the type of signal, and any other patterns I could detect. Over the years, these notebooks became a private collection of knowledge, filled with strange, cryptic details about broadcasts that were meant to be forgotten the moment they were sent. I would pore over them late at night, cross-referencing with other listeners' reports, trying to piece together the puzzle of what these stations were saying, and to whom. Of course, I could never really crack the codes. That wasn't the point. The mystery wasn't in the message. It was in the existence of the message at all. The fact that these broadcasts still existed, drifting out into the world with no clear purpose, made me wonder what else was hidden in the ether. What other secrets were being whispered through the airwaves, heard by no one but the few of us who cared enough to listen. It became an obsession, one that I didn't talk about much with the people in my life. Friends didn't understand, and I wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that didn't make me sound like a conspiracy theorist. My parents, now older, would listen politely when I'd mention it, but I could tell they thought it was just a quirky hobby, something I'd eventually grow out of. But they didn't know what it felt like to tune into the unknown, to hear something you weren't supposed to, something that made you feel like you were on the edge of a world you couldn't fully comprehend. As the years went on, I kept listening. I built a collection of recordings, even bought more sophisticated equipment to pick up distant signals from around the world. I found myself tuning into broadcasts from Russia, China, North Korea, even the occasional American signal that had somehow slipped through the cracks of time. I began to recognize the patterns, the little quirks in how different stations operated. Some played strange music before the numbers, others used tones or beeps to signal the start of a transmission. It was all so cryptic, so deliberately confusing, and yet it fascinated. Each station felt like a doorway into the past, into a world where secrets were passed through the air, encoded and indecipherable to anyone but the right person. I knew I'd never be able to crack the codes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the thrill of the search, the feeling that every time I turned on the radio, I might stumble onto something new, something no one else had heard. It was like chasing ghosts, elusive, fleeting, but so tantalizingly close. What started as an accident, a child's wild imagination sparked by a broken radio, had turned into a lifelong passion. It opened the door to a hidden world, one that most people would never notice, but one that pulsed quietly in the background of our lives, connecting the unseen world of espionage to the ordinary hum of everyday existence. And even now, years later, whenever I hear a train whistle in the distance late at night, I think of those strange, disjointed notes. I think of the signals still out there, waiting to be heard. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, there are still some secrets left to find.